My son-in-law walked into my sitting room with a notary in a briefcase, fully intending to have me signed out of my own life before the kettle had finished boiling. Outside, North London was a smear of rain and brake lights. Inside, Bradley shook his coat over Harold's rug and smiled like a man about to do something for my own good. Behind him hovered a young woman with a folder and a stamp, the notary, all nervous eyes and cheap blazer. Sarah came last, my daughter folded in on herself, caught between duty and dread. She still believed his version. "It's just paperwork, Mum. We just want you safe." She'd said it on the phone with that pleading softness adult children use when they're not quite sure they're doing the right thing. I had agreed too quickly for her to notice. You don't refuse the chance to let a man incriminate himself in your front room. Bradley set his briefcase on my coffee table without asking. No coaster, no apology. Men who plan to move you out rarely fret about your furniture. "Right," he said, smoothing his crooked tie. "Eleanor, given your recent incidents, we've spoken to a solicitor. We just need a few forms signed. Lasting power of attorney, authority over your finances and property. It means we can get you into a really good care home, secure, professional, less stress for all of us." He turned slightly towards the notary as he spoke, practicing concern in case she was ever called to repeat his lines. "Incidents?" I asked. "The gas. You left it on. The neighbor smelled it in the hall. And the fall on the stairs. You've been very confused, haven't you?" I had turned the hob off myself. The neighbor panicked. My knee is untrustworthy. My mind isn't. My GP calls my memory annoyingly sharp. Bradley prefers his patients docile. Have you ever sat and listened while someone quietly erases your competence and replaces it with their own script? If you have, you know the coal that settles into your bones. It isn't fear. It's a kind of clarity. I watched his right hand. There's a tiny twitch near the thumb when he lies. Harold and I noticed it years ago, the first time he talked about short-term cash flow issues. That hand rested now on a glossy folder, as if claiming the papers inside. "Before we start, remind me where the money for your new Audi came from." Sarah flinched. The notary's pen faltered. Bradley's jaw clenched, then relaxed. "I told you, Mum. Bonus, excellent quarter up a firm, performance incentives." He had told me that, and like any retired head teacher who spent 40 years with a police sergeant, I had quietly marked his work. 3 months earlier, he'd left a restaurant receipt on my counter. 2 mains, 2 glasses of wine, a sharing dessert, 1:15 p.m. on a Tuesday. Sarah teaches yet too. I had her photo of glitter-covered children from that afternoon. The restaurant name lodged in my mind. I started reading the joint account statements that still arrive at my letterbox because no one ever thinks to change the correspondence address. I underlined transfers in yellow, money slipping out of client accounts and back again, notes like temporary adjustment and loan repaid. One evening, with Harold's cracked mug by my elbow and the boiler ticking in the background, I added them up. £87,000, moving in circles. I printed, highlighted, dated. I spoke quietly to a former pupil in the economic crime unit and to one of Harold's old colleagues whose brother is a court clerk. They all said the same. Keep collecting, don't show your hand yet, and wait until he overreaches. "Eleanor, love," Bradley said now, turning the full beam of his charm on me. "You don't want to be drowning in bills and forms. Let us handle it. You sign these, and we'll make sure everything is paid. The house is maintained, your care is sorted. It's the sensible thing." Have you noticed how often sensible means beneficial to the person saying it. If that word has been used on you to push you aside, you already know the taste in my mouth. Sarah's voice was tight. Mum, we just want you safe. You know I'd never let anything bad happen to you. That was the cruelty of it. He'd hooked his plan onto her love and called it responsibility. Tell me, what would you have said to your own child in that moment? I still wonder if there was a softer route through this, but truth rarely fits through soft roots. Bradley opened his folder and spread papers over my coffee table, my name in block capitals on every page. Application to register lasting power of attorney. Proposed authority to manage my property and affairs. Near the back, half hidden, a draft court order with a judge's printed name and an empty space where an actual signature should have been. That little blank would matter later. I tucked it away in the mental drawer marked ammunition. He slid a pen toward me. Just here, Eleanor. Chloe will witness. Then we can get everything lodged with the court. The sooner we act, the better. Tell me, honestly, what would you have done? Shouted, thrown the papers back in his face. There is a dark sort of satisfaction in drama, I know, but I've spent a lifetime being told that raised female voices are proof of madness, while raised male voices are passion. Men like Bradley collect women's anger and call it evidence. So I stood up, letting my knee wobble, and walked to the sideboard. Harold's police medal glinted next to a jug of roses from the garden, their petals just starting to brown at the edges. Between them lay a navy folder I had placed there that morning after checking for the 4th time that everything was in order. I carried it back and set it calmly on top of his papers. No, I said. We'll start with mine. The notary's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. Sarah whispered my name as if she'd never seen me before.
Bradley snorted. That little scoff men use when they think they're humoring you. What's that meant to be? He asked. Your maths lesson, I said. I opened the folder. On the first page, a simple table. Dates, case references, amounts leaving client accounts, amounts returning. At the bottom, one neat line. Total misused funds, £87,000. His eyes traveled down the columns. I watched the color drain from his face in stages, like someone slowly pulling a plug. I lifted the page. Underneath, a photograph of him leaving a Brighton hotel with Amanda on his arm, his hand resting on the small of her back. The timestamp matched one of his client lunches. Below that, a printed email from his work address arranging our next escape. Sarah made a sound like air being punched out of her. It's not all here, I said. There are more screenshots, more statements, notes from a detective sergeant who has been very interested in your career progression. You ever watch a man realize he isn't the hunter anymore? The room actually changes shape, just a fraction. If you've seen it, you know that moment is far quieter than you'd expect. If you haven't, tell me honestly, would you want to? Bradley reached for the documents. I slid them back and from my cardigan pocket placed a small digital recorder on the table between us. A red light blinked, steady and unforgiving. It's been on since you walked in, I said. Every word about my supposed confusion, every attempt to get me to sign away my house, every little threat wrapped up as concern, recorded, dated, very tidy. Eleanor, this is paranoid nonsense. You've no idea what you're dealing with. Those figures are meaningless without context. You could get yourself into serious trouble for, I cut in, for talking to the police. for passing this to the Economic Crime Unit, for asking the court to confirm which orders Judge Clark has actually signed while he's on a beach in Spain. His mouth closed with a click. "I've done my homework," I told him. "You brought a notary. I brought witnesses too." I glanced toward the bay window. Headlights slid across the wet glass as a dark car pulled up outside my house. 2 figures stepped out, their shapes blurred by the rain, but walking with the unhurried purpose I recognized from years of watching Harold put on his uniform and go out to meet other people's disasters. If you're still with me, and yes, I mean you listening now, this is the point where my son-in-law realizes the frail old woman in the cardigan has arranged a different kind of transport for him. Bradley followed my gaze. The twitch in his hand had become a full shake. And that was the exact second the man who thought he'd come to take my house finally understood he'd walked straight into my trap, and that when he left my sitting room, it might be in the back of someone else's car.
Detective Martinez didn't knock so much as announce himself with a single heavy rap that made Bradley actually jump. By the time the front door opened, Bradley had swept his papers into a pile, trying to swallow his panic and put his reasonable professional mask back on, like a man smoothing his hair after being caught in the act. I sat down, deliberately, hands folded on my lap, as 2 officers in stab vests and 1 plainclothes detective stepped into my sitting room and changed the air. Martinez was mid-40s, calm eyes, sensible shoes, suit that had seen a lot of long days. He took in the layout in one glance, the coffee table, the notary, my navy folder, Bradley's briefcase, the red light on my recorder, and gave me a small nod that said he'd come prepared. The younger constable hovered near the door, already glancing at the hallway and upstairs in that way that meant, if asked, he could swear to where everyone had been. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Blackwood," Martinez said, his voice level, professional, carrying just enough warmth that Sarah's shoulders loosened a fraction. He confirms my name, my date of birth, my address, all the formalities that sound like bureaucracy but are really about lucking truth into place from the first second. Then he turned to Bradley, who was already halfway through unrolling his performance. Bradley introduced himself as my concerned son-in-law, an accountant, only thinking of my welfare, here with carefully drafted legal documents and a notary to ensure propriety. He gestured at the papers as if they were shields, not weapons. I've sat through hundreds of children caught cheating on exams. The rhythm was the same, only the stakes were higher and the suit more expensive. Martinez listened, neither encouraging nor interrupting, letting Bradley hang his own narrative on the hooks he'd chosen. When he finished, the detective glanced at the notary, who looked as though she very much regretted taking this job for whatever measly fee Bradley had offered. Then he looked at me, that tiny pause, which, if you've ever been believed by someone in authority after years of being talked over, you'll recognize as its own kind of mercy. I picked up my recorder and stated clearly that I had invited Bradley and the notary into my home at his request, that he had presented documents aiming to obtain control over my finances and property, and that I believed this was being done on the basis of false claims about my mental state and potentially fraudulent paperwork. My voice didn't wobble. The tremor lived in my fingers instead, hidden in the way they dug faint half-moons into my skirt. If you've ever had to narrate your own ambush while it's still unfolding, you know that strange split, half of you living it, half of you filing it. Bradley tried to laugh it off, saying I'd become very suspicious lately, that I've started making wild accusations and confused quite a few things. He wove my trips to the GP into evidence of decline, my retirement into isolation, the fall on the stairs into a pattern. Sarah stared at him as if he'd begun speaking a language she didn't recognize, torn between the husband she thought she knew and the woman who'd raised her. I'm asking you now, not for sympathy, but for clarity, because that's what he did in my sitting room. Edited me into a dottery caricature, expecting everyone present to nod along. Martinez let the lie hang a moment, then asked to see the documents Bradley intended me to sign. He put on disposable gloves, a small, mundane action that made Bradley's eyes flash, because only guilty people think about fingerprints when latex comes out. The detective spread the papers carefully on the table, reading in silence, lips moving just slightly over key phrases. Power of attorney, application to the court of protection, proposed guardianship for my diminished capacity, all very formal and on the surface legitimate. But near the back was a draft order, already filled in, naming Bradley as my deputy with authority over my property. At the bottom, in neat blue ink, sat a judge's name and a looping signature that was meant to look reassuringly official. I watched Martinez's gaze land on it. He said he would be arranging for a forensic document examiner to compare the signature with known exemplars from the court. Bradley scoffed, saying that was ridiculous bureaucracy and a waste of public money. I watched sweat gather just inside Bradley's hairline, a little shine betraying what his mouth still refused to deny.
Sarah's breathing had gone shallow. She was clutching her cardigan sleeves so tightly the knuckles showed white through the fabric. Then Martinez did something I respected him for. He turned fully to Sarah and said gently, "Mrs. Morrison, I appreciate this is very difficult. For the moment, I need you to listen, not intervene. If there's nothing improper here, that will become clear. If there is, you're going to want an accurate record of who did what and when." That was the line that finally made her eyes swing properly to me, not just flicker across. She saw, I think, for the first time, that this wasn't me being dramatic. This was procedure, built over years of other people's mistakes and pain. If you're still with me, tell me honestly, would you have wanted your child there or shielded away? I still don't know the kinder answer. With the forged order safely bagged, Martinez shifted to the finances. He asked Bradley whether he had ever moved client funds through personal or family accounts, even temporarily, for cash flow management. His denial came too quickly, the word never snapping out like a rubber band. I opened my Navy folder again. Bank statements slid across the table, each highlighted line a quiet, fluorescent accusation. Dates, amounts, references, cross-checked with Sarah's payslips and his firm's publicly available filings, an unflattering paper portrait of a man who thought numbers could be bullied into silence. Martinez studied them, then leaned back slightly. I've already had a brief from economic crime on some of this, he said, almost casually. This is your opportunity, Mr. Morrison, to explain it before it's explained for you in Crown Court. Because at the moment, I'm seeing around 87,000 pounds worth of unexplained client money movements. The number landed like a stone dropped into a pond. The ripples went everywhere. Bradley's mouth opened and closed, some half-formed story about temporary cover and miscommunication with a junior, dying on his tongue when he saw the way Martinez was watching him. The notary stared at the carpet, realizing perhaps that her day rate didn't cover this. The silence stretched and thickened. Then, in a voice that had lost its polish, Bradley muttered that, yes, there had been some short-term reallocations, that he had always intended to put it back, and that nobody lost anything in the long run. His right leg started to bounce, betraying a panic his words still tried to dress as reason. Martinez didn't raise his voice. He simply said that misusing client funds, even temporarily, constituted theft and fraud. and that the issue of my guardianship documents suggested intent to secure control over assets that could be used to plug those holes. He told Bradley he was now under caution, repeated the words slowly, that he did not have to say anything, but it may harm his defense if he did not mention something when questioned, something he later relied on in court.
You've heard that phrase on television, I'm sure. Hearing it in your own sitting room directed at your son-in-law is something else entirely. If any of this sounds even remotely familiar to your own life, you can tell me in the comments. You'd be astonished how many people discover their family dramas have official wording. The handcuffs came out when Bradley tried to stand up and grab the papers, shouting that this was a setup and that I was senile and vindictive. The constable moved faster than his outrage, pinning his arms with practiced efficiency. Metal clicked. The performance ended. He was read his rights fully, then guided firmly but not brutally towards my front door, his expensive shoes slipping slightly on the mat Harold used to grumble about. Sarah sobbed once, a sharp, involuntary sound, then clapped her hand over her mouth as if she'd broken some rule by reacting. I stayed seated, because if I'd stood, I might have put my hands on him myself, and I had no intention of giving anyone the satisfaction of calling that evidence of instability. Instead, I watched my son-in-law march past my roses, which were nodding gently in the drizzle as if they'd seen worse. After they took him, my living room became an incident room in miniature. An officer photographed the documents where they'd lain. Another logged my recorder, taking a statement on when I'd started using it and why. I handed over copies of everything in the Navy folder, keeping my originals in a separate pile because old teachers never surrender every worksheet at once. Martinez stood by the bay window, speaking quietly into his radio about seizing a work laptop from Bradley's home office and confirming with his firm that he was now under arrest. When he finished, he looked at me with a kind of weary respect and said, "Mrs. Blackwood, I think this is bigger than your house. We'll need you at the station for a formal interview, but not tonight. Tonight, you rest. Tomorrow, we start sorting through what exactly your son-in-law has dragged your family into." As he spoke, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and for the first time that afternoon, his professional mask slipped, just a fraction. He frowned and then asked the constable to step outside with him for a quick word about a related matter that had just come in. Something about another property transfer file with Bradley's name on it and the young woman and child attached to the paperwork. I watched him leave the room, my house suddenly too quiet, and felt a pulse of cold understanding that this wasn't just about my bank account or my roses, and the next knock on my door wouldn't be carrying a briefcase. It would be carrying the living, breathing consequences of Bradley's other life. 3 days after they took Bradley away in handcuffs, my daughter arrived on my doorstep with 2 suitcases and the look of someone whose life had been repossessed. The taxi's engine was still ticking when she said very quietly that she couldn't bear to sleep another night in that house. Rain clung to her hair, giving her the drowned rat look of someone who has survived something terrible but hasn't yet decided if she wants to keep surviving. I took one suitcase and led her inside, past the whole mirror where our reflections didn't match. Me upright, controlled, her folded in, hollow-eyed. She walked straight into the spare room as if she'd lived there last week, not 10 years ago when she first moved in with Bradley, cheeks flushed with the smug glow of a good marriage. Have you ever watched your child carry their entire married life in 2 cases in a carrying bag of toiletries? The first night she barely spoke. I made tea, toast, an omelette she didn't touch, then left her to scroll through her phone on the sofa, messages piling up from colleagues who couldn't believe it, and friends sending heart emojis as if they were sandbags against a rising tide. When she finally slept, twisted under my old spare duvet, I stood in the doorway and felt that familiar ache in my chest, the one where you want to cure something and all you've got is paracetamol and a blanket. By morning, she had moved into practical mode, which is how my girl has always coped with disaster. She phoned the mortgage provider, her solicitor, the school. She cancelled the joint gym membership she barely used and the streaming subscription Bradley insisted on. Each tiny cancellation was a stitch unpicking the life they'd sewn together. And if you've ever been through divorce admin, you'll know that's where the real funeral happens. We spent the next 2 days in a strange domestic limbo. Police called with updates, search warrants executed, devices seized, interviews booked, and I watched those calls chew away at the last remaining scraps of Sarah's denial. I cleaned obsessively, polishing surfaces that didn't need it, as though I could scrub his fingerprints off our memories with enough bicarbonate of soda and elbow grease. If you're still with me, tell me, do you clean when your life goes wrong, or do you let everything grow mold so the outside matches the inside? On the third afternoon, just as the light was starting to drain out of the November sky, the doorbell rang. Not the sharp, authoritative mock of police this time, but a hesitant double press ring, like someone who wasn't sure if they had the right address. I wiped my hands on a tea towel and opened the door to find a woman on the step with a 4-year-old boy half hiding behind her legs. She was younger than Sarah, late 20s perhaps, mixed race, hair pulled into a bun so tight it made her look both neat and slightly desperate. Her coat was too thin for the weather, the cheap polyester kind that goes shiny at the seams. The boy wore a dinosaur backpack and clutched a plastic car in one hand.
His eyes flicked up to mine, big, dark, assessing, then back to the safety of her hip. "Mrs. Blackwood?" the woman asked, her voice fraying at the edges. I'm Amanda. This is Tyler. We need to talk about Bradley." There was a beat where everything in me wanted to slam the door to protect Sarah from this walking, talking confirmation of betrayal. But the boy picked that moment to step forward, just half a pace, putting himself between us with a child's bewildering bravery. "Are you the grandma?" he asked, in that blunt, curious way little ones have when they haven't learned yet how complicated adults are. I felt something shift under my ribs. Here he was, the living embodiment of all the lines on those bank statements, all the hotel receipts, all the lies about client dinners and late meetings. And yet, he was just a child with slightly scuffed shoes and a fringe cut too short. Tell me honestly, would you have shut the door or opened it wider? I stepped back. "Come in," I said, "because whatever else I am my husband's widow and my daughter's mother, and both of them were watching me now, one from the spare room and one from the photograph on the mantelpiece." Amanda hesitated, then crossed the threshold, Tyler glued to her side, his small trainers squeaking damply on the laminate. Sarah came into the hallway, because of course she did. You can hear a silence as sharply as a shout when you're waiting for bad news. She took one look at Amanda and the boy and went very, very still, like a deer that has finally realized the headlights are not going to swerve. Her face went through at least 3 expressions in a heartbeat: confusion, recognition, then the raw slap of understanding. "I met you," she said slowly, "at the firm's Christmas do. You were at Bradley's table. You said you worked on the property team." The words came out flat, factual, as if naming the role would somehow reduce the enormity of what was standing in my hallway. Amanda nodded, fingers flexing against Tyler's shoulder. She said she hadn't come to gloat or to fight. She'd come because the police had knocked on her door that morning asking about joint transactions and gifted deposits. She said she was terrified and tired, and Tyler kept asking where Daddy was, and she couldn't lie to him anymore without choking. We moved into the sitting room as if acting out some ghastly etiquette drama. Betrayed wife on one sofa, mistress on the other, me in my armchair like a reluctant referee. Tyler climbed onto the rug and started driving his car around the edge of the coffee table, his little brum-brum noises weaving in and out of words like fraud, mortgage, signatory. Have you ever had a conversation where every adult sentence could be Exhibit A in court and there's a preschooler within earshot?
Amanda spoke in fits and starts, as if dragging words up a well. She and Bradley had met at work, yes. Their affair had bled into a business partnership of sorts.
There had been opportunities with clients wanting to move quickly on buy-to-lets, she said, and Bradley had found ways to massage paperwork, to register properties in other names, to use shell companies as stepping stones. At first, it had seemed like clever accounting, a victimless shuffle of numbers, and a system that was already unfair, she insisted. Then there were applications with forged income details, valuations that suspiciously matched what Bradley needed rather than what the market would bear, signatures on documents she hadn't actually seen the people sign. Bit by bit, she realized they weren't just bending the rules, they were steamrolling through them. She told us Tyler was conceived in the middle of all that, one more unplanned outcome of decisions that could never be undone. Bradley had promised he'd sort everything, that he'd leave Sarah when the time was right, the tired old script men recite when they want both stability and excitement. By the time Tyler was born, there were already a dozen properties in the web, and Amanda was in deep enough that backing out would mean confessing to more than just bad judgment. I watched Sarah listening, her face drained of blood, her hands locked together so tightly her knuckles looked carved from chalk. The betrayal wasn't only sexual, it was structural. Her husband hadn't just broken his vows, he'd built an entire parallel life on stolen money and forged signatures, and then tried to secure legal control over my house as if it were just another asset on his spreadsheet. If you've ever discovered that someone you loved is a stranger wearing their face, you'll understand the particular kind of nausea that comes with it. It isn't like in films where people scream and throw things, it's quieter. It's like standing on a floor you thought was solid and realizing it's been plywood over a sinkhole the whole time. Amanda reached into her handbag and pulled out a small, battered notebook and a cheap plastic USB drive. In the notebook, she said she tried to keep track of the deals that felt wrong. Addresses, dates, amounts, little arrows connecting names that shouldn't have touched. On the drive were scans of emails, internal memos, and, chillingly, spreadsheets Bradley had asked her to wipe after restructuring was complete. She admitted she was complicit, that she signed forms she shouldn't have and looked away when valuations came back miraculously perfect. But she also said she had a 4-year-old who deserved better than a mother in prison and a father in denial, and that if cooperating with whatever investigation was now rolling towards them, she would do it. Her voice shook, but there was steel under the tremor. Tyler, bored with his car, wandered over to my chair and leaned his elbows on my knees as if we'd known each other for years. Gran, he said, confidently, as if the title had simply been waiting in the air for him to claim it. I'm hungry. The word cut through the adult tension like a child's scissors through paper, crooked but decisive. It was ridiculous, really, how such a small, ordinary demand could rearrange the room. I took him to the kitchen, made him a cheese sandwich, and watched him swing his legs against my cupboards as he ate. When I came back, he trotted beside me clutching a biscuit, utterly unaware that his presence in my house was a confession rendered in flesh and crumbs. Amanda placed a USB drive in the center of my coffee table, on the exact spot where Bradley's forged court order had lain only days before. It glinted dully in the lamplight, unremarkable in every way except for the fact that it might contain enough evidence to drown more than one career and possibly tip a whole network of respectable people into the dock. As my fingers closed around that flimsy bit of plastic, I understood that this wasn't just about my daughter's broken marriage or my threatened house anymore. Whatever Bradley and Amanda had helped build in the shadows was big enough that once exposed, it would tear through the polite little world of solicitors, estate agents, and judges who all thought no one was watching. And that was the moment I realized that by keeping that drive, I wasn't just a retired head teacher and a widow.
I had just made myself the keeper of a secret that could blow out our entire county wide open. The USB drive sat on my saucer like an extra biscuit, while the tea got cold and the day moved on without asking my permission. It was absurd, really, that something so small could feel heavier than my wedding ring ever had. By the time Detective Martinez came back to the house, I'd wrapped it in kitchen roll and tucked it into my cardigan, as if it were an unexploded device I didn't quite trust not to go off. At the station, they put us in one of those interview rooms that try so hard to be neutral. It ends up feeling vaguely accusatory. Gray walls, scuffed table, plastic chairs that squeaked at the slightest movement. Amanda sat beside me, eyes fixed on the laminate, while a Judy solicitor shuffled papers and murmured about cooperation and mitigation. I placed the USB and her notebook on the table with the care you use for newborns and expensive china. A digital forensics officer came in, young, ponytail, NHS lanyard tangled with her ID badge, fingers already twitching for the keyboard. Martinez explained that the National Crime Agency had been looped in, that the CPS were taking an interest, that this might go far beyond one greedy accountant and a handful of dodgy buy-to-lets. If you've never heard your quiet suburban life described in those kinds of terms, believe me, it makes your stomach drop in a very particular way. They cloned the contents of the drive, documented every step, logged Amanda's notebook as contemporaneous record.
Then they interviewed her properly. The red light of the recorder blinking in the center of the table like an unblinking eye. I sat behind the glass later, watching on a monitor with Sarah. The two of us silent except for her occasional strangled breath when Bradley's name came up. Amanda spoke for hours. She detailed how it started with one creative restructure of a landlord's portfolio and grew into a system. Shell companies registered to vacant offices, properties ping-ponging between names at just the right valuations, mortgage applications dressed up in borrowed income and invented tenants. 17, possibly 18 properties in total, she said, brow furrowed as she tried to remember every address, every forged flourish. Have you ever listened to someone map out a crime and realized you're hearing the blueprints of a trap that's been under your feet for years? Then came the part that made even the forensic officer glance up from her screen. Bradley hadn't just shuffled money around, he'd harvested secrets. He'd kept copies of clients' ID documents, bank statements, sensitive emails that landed in his work inbox by mistake, even the odd compromising photograph from personal messages they'd foolishly sent over office Wi-Fi. He'd joked back then that data is the new currency. Amanda admitted she'd laughed along without really understanding what he meant. What he meant, it turned out, was blackmail. On the clone drive, the forensic officer found a folder coyly labeled Insurance, nested 3 levels down under something bland about Q4 reporting. Inside were subfolders with initials and nicknames, a counselor with undeclared rental income, a planning officer with a gambling habit, a solicitor who'd had an affair with a client and left a trail of explicit messages on her work phone. And then, more chillingly still, documents relating to a serving judge's offshore investment vehicle. Martinez didn't show us the content. He isn't reckless. But he told me enough in the family room at the station for me to see how far the rot might go. "This isn't just fraud, Mrs. Blackwood," he said, hands wrapped round a disposable coffee cup as if he needed the heat. "If half of this proves out, we're looking at systemic corruption, people in positions of trust being nudged, threatened, or bought." Back home that night, the house felt like a nerve center rather than a retirement nest. Sarah sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open, trolling through emails from her solicitor and the union. Amanda perched on a dining chair, eyes red, clutching a glass of water with both hands as if it were all that tethered her to the room. Tyler slept upstairs, sprawled across my old-fashioned duvet,
utterly oblivious to the fact that his father's choices were now official case numbers. We had the conversation then that I'd been circling since they walked into my hallway.
What did we do with Amanda? With this woman who had helped build Bradley's house of cards and was now handing us the floor plan? Sarah surprised me. Her voice was hoarse but steady as she said that whatever else happened, Tyler was innocent, and Amanda was at least trying to put things right. If you've ever had to choose between pure moral outrage and the messy practicality of protecting a child, you'll know the bitter taste of that compromise. In the end, we agreed on two things. Amanda would cooperate fully, with proper legal advice, and Tyler would stay with us while the investigation played out. Not forever, not yet. We didn't talk in those terms. It would have broken something delicate. We talked about stability and routine and keeping him out of the blast zone, phrases I suspect every social worker in the country hears weekly. A few days later, Amanda sat in another meeting room, this time with someone from the CPS and a serious-looking woman from the Serious Fraud Office, her hair scraped back so tightly she might have been held together by it. They laid out the framework of a cooperation agreement, full disclosure, no lies, testimony in any future trials, and in return a recommendation for a reduced sentence and consideration of her childcare responsibilities. Amanda nodded, tears running silently down her face, pen trembling as she signed each page. If you've ever tried to fix something you helped break, knowing it might still cost you your freedom, you'll understand the particular courage it takes, I said to the invisible audience in my head. And if you haven't, be careful before you tell yourself you'd have done better. It's easy to be virtuous in hypothetical scenarios. Reality tends to be muddier. Meanwhile, my dining room evolved into what Martinez jokingly called the Blackwood Operations Center. The table disappeared under printouts, case files, rough flowcharts showing how money had moved through various accounts. Detectives came and went at all hours, their visible police vests slung over the backs of my chairs like abandoned shells, while Tyler's crayons rolled between evidence bags and my old lesson planners. News of Bradley's arrest and the wider investigation leaked, of course. At first, it was a short piece on the local website, the sort that sits below council roadworks and bin collections. Local accountant questioned in property fraud probe. Then one of the tabloids sniffed out the judicial angle, and suddenly my quiet North London street was interesting enough for a camera crew, and a headline about bent judges and dirty money. Reporters began to lurk by my front gate, pretending they just happened to be walking their dogs repeatedly past my roses. A van from a rolling news channel parked opposite, its satellite dish tilting accusatorily at my upstairs windows.
They shouted questions whenever the door opened. Mrs. Blackwood, did you know? Is it true your son-in-law tried to have you declared unfit? How much did you stand to lose? At first, I ignored them, ushering Sarah and Tyler in and out like a human shield, my spine a straight line of refusal. But they weren't going away, and the story had grown teeth. Anonymous sources from Bradley's firm giving quotes, grainy long-lens shots of Amanda outside the station, speculative nonsense about organized crime and links to Eastern European gangs. If you've ever had your private catastrophe turned into public entertainment, you'll know the unique humiliation of hearing strangers debate your life over their morning coffee. Martinez suggested issuing a short written statement through the press office, something bland about cooperating fully. I listened, nodded, then looked out at my rain-damp garden, the roses bending under the weight of it all, and felt a stubborn heat rise in my chest. No, if the story was going to be told, I was damned if it was going to be told entirely by people who'd never set foot in my kitchen. So one evening, after Tyler was in bed and the reporters had retreated to their vans with lukewarm takeaway pizza, I sat down with Sarah and Amanda and drafted my own words. We wrote and rewrote them, trimming anything that sounded like self-pity, sharpening anything that sounded like evasion. Social media was already awash with opinion, some sympathetic, some vicious, and I had no intention of adding fuel to the wrong fire. I said, "If you're still here with me, you already know what it feels like to have other people narrate your life," I said quietly, more to you than to them. This was my chance to take the microphone back for just a moment. Sarah squeezed my hand. Amanda watched me as if I were building her a bridge one plank at a time. The next afternoon, I stepped out through my front door, cardigan buttoned on, lipstick on, my late husband's police medal pinned discreetly on the inside of my lapel like a private talisman. The cameras whirred to life, lenses zooming in, the little red recording lights blinking like mechanical eyes. I positioned myself between my rose bushes on purpose. If they wanted a picture, they could have the thorns as well as the petals. I read slowly and clearly. I said that my family had been blindsided by Bradley's crimes, that we were cooperating with the police and had confidence in the investigation. I made it plain that Tyler was an innocent child who deserved stability and love, that Amanda was assisting the authorities, and that we intended to prioritize his welfare over any embarrassment or gossip. Then, because I am who I am, I added one final line that I knew would make the evening bulletins. I said, "This house has always been a place of learning and accountability." I glanced back at the windows where I had once marked books late into the night.
We won't be bullied, bought off, or silenced. Not by one man, and not by anyone who helped him think he could get away with it. The questions came thick and fast as I turned to go back inside, but I didn't answer them. I'd said what needed saying. My phone buzzed in my pocket before I'd even shut the door, Martinez's name on the screen, and a single text. "Eleanor, we need to talk urgently. The insurance files link to more than just a judge, and once these names come out, your family won't be the only ones under siege." The morning Amanda was sentenced, London was caught in that brittle cold that makes everything feel slightly unreal, as though the city is holding its breath. I sat beside her in the waiting area of the Crown Court, my gloves folded neatly in my lap, pretending my heartbeat wasn't audible across the room. She'd barely spoken all morning. Her solicitor did the talking, murmuring about cooperation, childcare, and the sheer volume of evidence she'd provided. When we stood before the judge, Amanda's hands trembled so hard she couldn't keep them clasped. The prosecution laid out the fraud, the forged transfers, the falsified documents, the 17 properties shuffled like cards in a rigged deck. But then they shifted tone, outlining her assistants, the names she'd given, the files she'd unearthed. You could feel the courtroom recognize what she'd risked to come clean. 18 months in a minimum security facility, half suspended, mandatory rehabilitation, supervision, and ongoing cooperation. It could have been far worse. She knew it, and the judge knew it. Tyler's name was the only one that cracked her composure. When they mentioned her right to maintain contact, she let out a breath that wasn't quite a sob. Afterwards, outside, the cold bit straight through her coat. She hugged Tyler as though he were the last warm thing in the world, breathing him in, memorizing him, imprinting the moment like she feared prison walls would scrape the memory away. I stood a little back, the guardian figure, watching her kiss her child's forehead with a desperation no punishment could dilute. If you've ever had to hand over a child knowing you won't tuck them in that night, you'll understand the kind of courage I saw in her. I murmured, not sure if I meant it for you or for myself. Sarah wiped her eyes with her sleeve. She'd promised Amanda she'd bring Tyler for visits, and my daughter is not a woman who breaks promises lightly. Back home, our quiet North London semi shifted shape again. Tyler needed routine. School runs, packed lunches, bedtimes, and she threw herself into them because structure, for her, is a balm.
She began therapy, filed for divorce, and discovered a small reservoir of strength she didn't know she possessed. She also changed her number, finally blocking Bradley's prison letters except for the ones the solicitor insisted she keep for evidence. It was around then that David arrived in our orbit, an old colleague of Sarah's, recently single, soft-spoken, with the kind of steady kindness Sarah now gravitated towards, like a plant reaching for light. Their first coffee date was accidental. The second wasn't. By the third, she came home with a shy glow I hadn't seen since she was 22 and about to start her first teaching job. I liked him. More importantly, Tyler liked him, and 4-year-olds are better bullshit detectors than most adults. I watched them in the garden one afternoon, David crouched beside Tyler, inspecting a worm as though it were the most fascinating creature alive. Sarah watched them through the window with a look that made my chest ache and settle at once. "If you've ever survived a betrayal," I told you quietly, "you'll know the terror of discovering you might still be capable of hope." Sarah didn't say the word dating out loud for weeks, as though speaking it would jinx the fragile happiness forming under her ribs. But the house felt lighter, and even Tyler sensed it, humming as he colored, his little world slowly stitching itself back together. Meanwhile, news filtered from the police. Bradley's cooperation had become substantial. Apparently, prison sobered him enough to recognize that the only currency he had left was information, and he traded it with the desperation of a drowning man offering up air bubbles. He implicated colleagues, judges, clerks, anyone who'd profited from the quiet rock that had crept through the county's dealings. Martinez contacted me regularly now, updates given with the briskness of a man juggling too many fires. Early on, he warned me gently that Bradley kept asking after Sarah and Tyler during interviews, as though trying to piece together a family he'd shattered. I didn't trust that interest. Guilt wears many masks. But I knew better to dismiss the possibility that consequences had finally made him see the scope of his destruction. We visited Amanda twice a month, bringing Tyler with carefully curated simplicity, picture books, crayons, biscuits. The visits were supervised but not harsh, the furniture functional but softened by community donations and institutional optimism. Tyler would launch into her arms every time, and Amanda would hold him with such fierce gentleness it hurt to watch. Between those visits, my dining room continued its second life as an impromptu war room. Files stacked, investigators briefed, timelines drawn and redrawn. It felt strangely reminiscent of my years as a head teacher. Crisis meetings, safeguarding decisions, paperwork that could save or ruin lives. Only now, instead of exam appeals and staff rotas, we were dealing with mortgage fraud and blackmail victims. Sarah finalized her divorce quietly, with none of the drama tabloids fantasized about. Her solicitor handled the details. Bradley, on legal advice, didn't contest.
When the decree absolute arrived, Sarah placed it on the kitchen table, stared at it for a long moment, then folded it and tucked it in a drawer. No ceremony, just closure, neatly filed beside receipts and spare keys. David became a fixture, not in the loud, intrusive way that Bradley had, but like a well-placed lamp in a once-shadowed room. He drove Tyler to the park, cooked dinners on nights Sarah worked late, learned how to braid hair using one of Tyler's dolls because it might be useful someday. I watched this man step quietly into the cracks left by another, and for the first time in months, my shoulders unclenched. One evening, after Tyler had gone to bed, Sarah told me she was thinking, just thinking, about letting him meet Bradley one day, supervised, structured, controlled. "Children deserve truth," she said, voice steady but eyes uncertain. "But they also deserve safety." I didn't tell her what to do. I've learned that maternal advice, given uninvited, can sour the very air. Instead, I told her I trusted her judgment. A small sentence, but the truth. And then came the night that redrew the edges of my quiet family life. Tyler had just finished his bath when my phone buzzed with a withheld number, usually a sign of either a scam call or Detective Martinez. I answered, expecting a case update. Instead, a brisk voice asked for Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood and identified themselves as an officer from the prison. My stomach dropped. The officer said Bradley had requested to list me, not Sarah, as an approved contact for correspondence regarding sensitive materials relevant to ongoing investigations. They phrased it carefully, as though reading from a script. They also said he had prepared a letter addressed directly to me to be released pending clearance, containing information he claimed only Mrs. Blackwood will understand the significance of. I sank into my hallway chair, still holding Tyler's damp towel in one hand and the phone pressed to my ear with the other. The officer waited patiently for my response, but all I could think was how deeply unsettling it was that a man who once tried to steal my house was now reaching out, not as a manipulator, but as something else entirely, something that might resemble remorse or desperation, or a final power play disguised as cooperation. And as Tyler padded into the room in his dinosaur pajamas, clutching his toy car, I realized something terrible and unavoidable. Whatever Bradley had written, whatever secrets he'd finally chosen to drag into the light, they were coming to my door, whether I wanted them or not. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning, wrapped in the kind of institutional envelope that looks as though it's been handled by too many reluctant hands. I held it by the edges, as if gripping it too tightly might smear whatever truth was trapped inside.
For a moment, I just stood in the hallway, the kettle hissing behind me, thinking how strange it was that the man who'd once tried to shove me into a care home now communicated through prison stationery. I didn't open it straight away. I made tea first, habit, ritual, armor, and watched the steam coil into the kitchen's soft winter light. Sarah was at work. Tyler was building a Lego ambulance under the table, and the quietness between us was brittle, like a pane of glass no one wanted to tap. "Gran?" he asked, without looking up. "Is that from Daddy?" I told him not yet. I couldn't lie, but I couldn't give him the truth either, not until I'd read it myself. When I finally slit the envelope open, the first thing that fell out wasn't paper, but a small plastic wallet containing a certified document stamped by the prison's legal office. It looked too official to be sentimental, too formal to be manipulative. The second item was a folded letter, handwriting unmistakably Bradley's, looping, arrogant, but now slightly uneven, as though prison had sanded away some of his flourish. He opened with an apology I didn't believe at first. Not the slick, PR-ready kind, but a ragged one, full of sentences that doubled back and scratched themselves out. He said he finally saw the truth of what he'd done. To Sarah, to Amanda, to Tyler, to me. He wrote about shame as if it were a physical thing in his cell, settling on his chest each night like a weighted blanket he couldn't throw off. Have you ever read someone's regret and not known if it was confession, performance, or both at once? Then the letter shifted. Bradley wrote that during his first months inside, he'd been approached, indirectly at first, then less subtly, by men wanting reassurance he wouldn't share what he shouldn't. He realized they weren't talking about the fraud, but about the blackmail files he'd kept hidden, the compromising documents he'd intended as leverage should anything go wrong. And when he understood that, he'd panicked, not for himself, he claimed, but for what could happen to Tyler and Sarah if those men felt threatened. So he'd made a choice. He'd offered full cooperation to the National Crime Agency. He'd mapped out the routes through which money had been laundered, the officials who'd been leaned on, the firms that knowingly facilitated certain transfers. 14 officials implicated in total. Judges, clerks, solicitors, planners. Names I recognized. Names I'd shaken hands with at community events. Names that smiled while hiding rot beneath their suits. Bradley said he'd spent months working with investigators, reconstructing the entire system from memory and documents retrieved from his devices. He described it as atonement, though even as I read the word, I felt my mouth twist. Men like Bradley seek redemption the way some people seek Wi-Fi signal, desperately, and often only for their own convenience.
Yet something about his precision of details pressed a cold finger against my spine. The legal document he'd enclosed confirmed it. The Home Office had approved a whistleblower compensation claim, awarding him £750,000 for exposing systemic corruption. And then, impossibly, he wrote that he had arranged for the entire sum to be transferred to me. Me. Not Sarah, not Amanda, not Tyler. Me. He said I was the only person who would use it correctly, that he trusted me the way he'd once trusted no one. I had to put the letter down then, the words blurring as though someone had knocked the world slightly off balance. I rang Martinez immediately. He listened, silent at first, then let out a long breath that sounded like a man who'd been waiting for the other shoe to drop. He told me the FBI, yes, even across the Atlantic, corruption spreads like ivy, had confirmed Bradley's information was pivotal in cracking the network, that without his files, half the people implicated would still be sipping wine in private clubs, untouched by consequence. If you've ever learned that the villain of your life has quietly become the key to someone else's justice, you'll know the sick, disorienting vertigo I felt. That afternoon, Sarah came home pale-faced from school. I showed her the letter. She read it standing up, shoulders tight, jaw clenched, eyes glistening in that way she gets when emotion tries to breach her defenses. "Why you?" she whispered, as though the choice wounded and relieved her simultaneously. I didn't have an answer, only the instinct that sometimes broken men reach for the one person who refused to be broken by them. For the rest of the evening, the letter lay on the table between us, like a fragile treaty. Tyler colored dinosaurs beside it, blissfully unaware of the financial and moral earthquake sitting centimeters from his crayons. At one point, he asked if Daddy could come home now that he'd said sorry properly. Sarah gripped my hand so hard I felt the bones shift. The next day, representatives from the NCA and the Home Office arrived at my door with formal confirmation. The whistleblower reward was legitimate, processed, and already transferred. They asked delicately, cautiously, what I intended to do with it. I looked around the dining room, still cluttered with case files and scribbled flowcharts, and realized the answer had been circling me for months. I wanted a space for victims like us, people caught in the crossfire of white-collar crime, people whose lives were quietly dismantled by forged documents and clever lies. A place for support, for legal guidance, for rebuilding. A foundation, not a charity built from pity, but from anger, harnessed into purpose. When I said it out loud, something in the room shifted, as though the idea had been waiting, patient and inevitable. We named it the Blackwood Family Justice Foundation. Sarah and David offered to run operations once she finished her divorce proceedings. Amanda, when released, would take on financial counseling using her experience not to excuse, but to warn. And Tyler, well, the foundation's mission statement would one day bear his name in a footnote.
though he would never know the weight of that choice until he was old enough to understand. If you've ever turned your own trauma into a blueprint for someone else's protection, I murmured that night, you'll know the peculiar blend of pride and sorrow that sits in your throat like a stone. The house felt different, not lighter, but stronger, as if its beams had learned to brace themselves against storms rather than brace for collapse. For a few days, everything settled into a tentative rhythm. Sarah and David grew closer. Amanda wrote from prison with cautious optimism. Tyler thrived in school. And I took calls from solicitors and policymakers with the steely calm of someone who had spent a lifetime teaching difficult children. But beneath it all, Bradley's letter hummed like an electric cable. A reminder that redemption, once begun, rarely ends neatly. Then one evening, as I sat sorting through donation pledges for the foundation, my landline rang, the one I rarely use, the one whose number only a handful of people have. I lifted the receiver, expecting Martinez, or perhaps the solicitor. Instead, a voice I hadn't heard outside of nightmares said, quietly, "Eleanor, they've moved me. Something's happened, and you need to be ready." When Bradley said, "They've moved me," his voice had lost its old varnish. It sounded scraped, functional, like everything unnecessary had been sanded off. The prison, he explained, had transferred him to a different wing for his own safety after more names from the corruption case started appearing in charge sheets. "Some of them blame me," he said. And then after a pause that seemed to stretch down the line, "My tariffs being reviewed. I might be out sooner than we thought. You need to be ready." After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the wood grain as though it might offer a simpler pattern than the one my life had become. Ready for what? I wanted to ask him. Ready for his remorse? His return? His attempt to rebrand himself as a changed man and Tyler's father? Tell me, if you'd been in my chair, would you have felt relief, dread, or that peculiar guilty mixture of both? We didn't tell Tyler immediately. You don't drop that sort of news on a child like a falling piano. Instead, I told Sarah and David first, around the same table where we'd opened the whistleblower letter. Sarah went gray around the mouth, fingers knotting together, while David listened with that careful, measured expression I'd come to trust, already thinking in terms of safeguarding in contact conditions. Life, in its stubborn way, refused to pause for our emotional logistics.
The Blackwood Family Justice Foundation took shape faster than I dared hope. We found a small office above a charity shop, painted the walls ourselves, filled it with donated furniture, and a kettle that never had time to cool. People came, timid, wary, angry, bringing stories of pensions raided, savings siphoned, homes nearly lost to administrative errors that smelled exactly like Bradley. Amanda's early release date was set for a damp April morning, barely a year into her sentence. The conditions were strict: curfew, regular meetings with her probation officer, mandatory courses, but they were also survivable. When she walked out of the gate, holding a clear plastic bag of belongings, Tyler hurled himself at her with such force she almost stumbled, laughing and crying at the same time in a way that made my throat ache. We'd agreed, sensibly, that she wouldn't move straight back in. My house had become Tyler's ground zero of stability, and we weren't going to rip up his foundations just because paperwork allowed it. Instead, we helped her settle into a small flat 10 minutes walk away. Close enough for breakfasts and bedtimes, far enough that everyone could breathe. Amanda started at the foundation part-time, helping victims untangle the same sort of paperwork she'd once weaponized. Watching Amanda and Sarah together was like watching scar tissue learn to bend. At first, their conversations were stiff, functional, orbiting Tyler and logistics like planets around a very small sun. Gradually, the orbit shifted.
They began to share gallows humor about bureaucracy, to swap stories about sleep deprivation and the petty tyrannies of school WhatsApp groups. If you've ever watched two women choose to collaborate instead of compete, you'll know how quietly revolutionary that can feel. The foundation became our shared project, our penance, and our protest. We held clinics where people could bring letters they didn't understand, ran workshops on recognizing financial grooming, lobbied counselors about tightening oversight. Sometimes, late at night, I'd look around the cluttered little office at Sarah on the phone, David fixing a wobbly shelf, and think, this is what Bradley accidentally built, a resistance forged from the wreckage of his greed. It was in that atmosphere, busy, hopeful, fragile, that David proposed to Sarah. No grand gestures, no kneeling in public, just the two of them in my garden after Sunday lunch, Tyler asleep on the sofa inside, washing up, soaking in the sink. I watched from the kitchen window as Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, then dropped to clutch his hand, and for the first time in a very long time, she smiled without any shadow behind it. Later that evening, over tea gone lukewarm, they told me they wanted David to adopt Tyler once everything was legally possible. The word hung in the air like incense, heavy, meaningful, a little suffocating.
I want him to know he's chosen, Sarah said, voice steady, not just tolerated. I believed her, but we all knew there was a snag. However many crimes Bradley had committed, he was still Tyler's father in the eyes of the law. So began a new round of meetings, this time not with fraud investigators, but with social workers and family solicitors. They spoke gently about parental responsibility, contact orders, the child's best interests, all the language that turns private heartbreak into legal construct. Adoption would almost certainly require either Bradley's consent or a judge deciding that his opposition wasn't in Tyler's favor. It brought us back to the one man we'd all tried, in our different ways, to move beyond. I agreed to see Bradley first, with a prison family liaison worker present. The visit room smelled faintly of disinfectant and overcooked vegetables, the sort of institutional odor that clings to your clothes long after you leave. When he walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. Thinner, yes, but also quieter. Not diminished exactly, but stripped back. A man who'd lost the luxury of self-delusion. We talked about Tyler, about his reading, his obsession with diggers, the way he'd started explaining playground politics as if they were cabinet reshuffles. He listened, eyes shining in a way I wouldn't have trusted from the man he'd once been. He said he'd been working in the prison's legal library, helping other inmates with appeals and paperwork, and that for the first time in his life, he'd started to understand consequence, not as an abstract risk, but as a daily reality. When I raised the possibility of David adopting Tyler, he flinched, as though I'd slapped him, then went very still. The liaison worker watched carefully, ready to step in if tempers rose, but they didn't. They just shifted. Bradley asked hoarsely whether Tyler would still know who he was, whether he'd be allowed contact, whether his son would grow up thinking he'd simply abandoned him. I didn't soften the truth. I told him he'd forfeited the right to uncomplicated fatherhood the day he chose fraud over family. If you've ever had to tell someone the damage they've done can't be undone, only managed, you'll know how heavy those words feel. I murmured later, the scene replaying in my mind. In the end, Bradley said he wouldn't stand in the way if professionals agreed adoption was best. He signed a statement to that effect, hand shaking slightly, and when he passed the pen back, his fingers brushed mine, cold and unfamiliar. Almost 2.5 years after the day he'd swaggered into my sitting room with a notary in tow, Bradley walked out of prison through a different set of doors. No press this time. The story had moved on, as stories do. He went first to approved premises,
under curfew and supervision, and started work, of all things, as a paralegal for a legal charity that specialized in financial abuse cases. Martinez, who'd put in a quiet word, told me dryly, if he's going to use that brain of his, better it's in service of fixing than breaking. The first post-release meeting with Tyler took place in a contact center that tried too hard to be cheerful. Bright murals, plastic chairs, an attempt at warmth that couldn't quite erase the smell of bureaucracy. Tyler clung to my hand at first, recognizing Bradley from photographs but not from memory, his little body humming with confused energy. Bradley sat on the edge of his chair, shoulders hunched, hands visibly empty. No gifts, no bribes, just himself and whatever fragments of honesty he'd managed to salvage. They spoke awkwardly at first. Tyler told him about dinosaurs and a boy called Finlay who didn't share. Bradley asked about school and favorite colors, his eyes darting to me occasionally as if checking he wasn't crossing any invisible line. When Tyler finally climbed onto the chair beside him, inspecting the calluses on his father's fingers with solemn curiosity, something in the room shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the faintest outline of a bridge. Over the following months, contact settled into a cautious pattern. Supervised visits became supervised park trips, then carefully monitored afternoons. David stayed present but slightly back, neither staking a territorial claim nor shrinking into the background. He understood, instinctively, that his solidity was his strength, not any attempt to compete. The adoption proceedings moved forward in parallel, the court slowly weaving our complicated history into a new legal shape. One evening, after a long day at the foundation, I found myself in the garden with all of them. Sarah and David discussing wedding venues by the shed, Amanda sketching ideas for a financial literacy workshop at the patio table, Tyler racing between them with a toy airplane, and Bradley standing uncertainly by the roses, hands in his pockets, waiting to see if he was allowed to step further onto this fragile patch of ground we'd made. I picked up a spare trowel, weighed it in my palm, and realized that whatever happened next would decide whether he remained a visitor in this family or something harder to name. I walked towards him, the handle warm from my hand, feeling every eye in that garden turn to watch. And as I held the trowel out between us, poised to ask the question that would bind him publicly to the very justice he'd once tried to outrun, I saw a flicker of fear and hope cross his face, and understood that his answer could still change everything. I didn't speak straight away. I simply held the trowel between us, the weight of it balancing perfectly in my palm, the late afternoon light catching on the metal like an invitation and a warning. Bradley looked at it as though it were evidence or absolution, or perhaps both. His shoulders lifted in a breath he didn't know how to release.
Behind him, my rose bushes stirred in the breeze, the same ones he'd once tried to steal from me along with my home. And for a moment, the symmetry of it all felt almost theatrical. When he finally reached out, he didn't grab the tool. He accepted it the way a man accepts a sentence. His fingers curled slowly around the handle, knuckles pale, jaw working as though forming a silent vow. I nodded towards the patch of soil beside the roses, a space I'd deliberately left bare all winter, as though waiting for him without ever admitting it aloud. We knelt together, not close, not touching, just two adults with too many consequences between them, turning the earth like strangers learning a language through action rather than speech. I told him we were planting sunflowers, not because they were symbolic, though they were, but because Tyler loved them and insisted they were happy flowers. Bradley listened, head bowed, soil under his nails for what might have been the first honest labor of his adult life. Tyler burst out of the house then, waving a packet of seeds with the earnest enthusiasm only a child can muster. "Gran, can Daddy help me plant the tall ones?" he asked,
as though the question weren't a seismic shift in itself. I glanced at Sarah, she looked back at me, then at Bradley, and gave a tiny nod that said more than any speech could. If you've ever had to read a room where forgiveness hangs by a thread, you'll know how loud silence can be. We planted the seeds slowly, carefully. Tyler narrated every moment, which seed was the leader, which would race to the sun, which would become the tallest in England. Bradley answered softly, voice roughened by something that wasn't quite tears and wasn't quite gratitude. Watching them, I felt that odd ache of witnessing a beginning stitched directly onto the ruins of an ending. Afterwards, we had tea in the garden, mismatched mugs, rainwater caught in saucers, biscuits slightly stale because I had forgotten to reseal the tin. Amanda arrived halfway through, hesitating at the gate until Tyler launched himself at her with a delighted shout that dissolved every barrier instantly. She took in the sight of Bradley kneeling by the roses, and her face flickered with a dozen emotions: fear, anger, relief, before she smoothed it into something steady.
Amanda ran financial recovery workshops twice a week, teaching people to recognize the very tricks she once helped design. Sarah and David handled operations, juggling their wedding planning with meetings, case reviews, and the quiet heroism of navigating bureaucratic labyrinths without losing their humanity. Bradley, surprisingly, or perhaps inevitably, had become the Foundation's unofficial consultant. He reviewed case files, spotted patterns in paperwork, advised on tactics used by fraudsters who believed themselves clever. He never overstepped. He never tried to position himself at the center. He simply showed up, collected chairs after events, fixed broken cabinet hinges, proofread reports. The small, humble tasks of someone trying to build rather than destroy. One afternoon, I watched him help Tyler with homework at the kitchen table. Phonics cards, little plastic counters, a felt-tip pen that kept losing its lid. Bradley didn't patronize him, didn't push too hard, didn't retreat into guilt. He just fathered, quietly, consistently, as though each moment were a promise he intended to keep. And in that simple rhythm, homework, tea, bath, bedtime story, there was a kind of healing I hadn't expected to see in my lifetime. Sarah and David were married on a soft June evening in a small registry office near Hampstead Heath. Amanda signed as one of the witnesses, her hand steady, her smile genuine. Tyler wore a tiny waistcoat and announced proudly to every guest that he had 2 moms and 2 dads and a gran who tells everyone off, but in a good way. People laughed, but I felt the truth of it settle into my bones with a weight that was almost holy. When David later began the formal adoption process for Tyler, the social worker visited our home for the final assessment. She sat in my living room, taking notes as Tyler built Lego towers, Sarah and David answered questions, and Bradley stood quietly in the doorway, hands clasped, waiting his turn to speak. He told the social worker he would support whichever legal arrangement protected Tyler best, that he understood the implications, and that he was willing to be whatever version of father the courts deemed safe. She watched him with professional scrutiny, and I could see her recalibrating him. Not absolving, never that, but recognizing the sincerity of a man who'd burned his own life down and was now rebuilding with careful, trembling hands. When she left, she shook my hand and said, "You've created something remarkable here." I wanted to tell her it wasn't me. It was the soil we'd chosen to grow in. Weeks later, the adoption order was granted. Tyler became, in the eyes of the law, Sarah and David's son. That evening, we celebrated with fish and chips eaten straight from the paper, Tyler wearing a paper crown he'd made at school. Bradley didn't stay long. He understood the boundary instinctively, slipping away after a quiet hug and a whispered promise to see Tyler at the weekend. Life settled then, in that imperfect, beautiful way it sometimes does after storms. The foundation thrived, our family's odd constellation held, and the roses bloomed fiercer than ever, thick, red, unapologetic. Some mornings I'd catch Tyler watering the sunflowers, now towering overhead, chatting away to them as though they were old friends growing just for him.
And yet, because every story, even the hopeful ones, has a shadow, that sense of calm was not the end. One evening, as I closed the office and stepped into the cool night air, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Just 3 words, no punctuation, no signature, but unmistakably typed by someone who knew exactly how to stop my breath mid-step. They're coming back.